So many types of photos are about capturing a big subject and squeezing it onto a small frame. It could be a tall building, a big river, a bridge, sweeping landscape, even a big group shot of people. But for me, one of the most interesting styles of photography are small details, patterns, textures, shapes, kind of things that you find when you really look closely at subjects. So what we're going to do in this video is have a walk around town and see what we can find. And then look at where you like the way this comes across. Wander around any city these days and it won't be long before you see a bunch of padlocks attached to railings or bridges, declarations of love and other cryptic messages. I think they make really nice detail shots, and you can also use them as a really nice contrast on a fairly dull day like today. So what I'm looking for is something that's got some nice colour on it. In this instance, this nice pink padlock here, although equally you could use rust as your colour or texture as a contrast to the background. Now, by focusing very, very close to the subject, it also gives me something called a shallow depth of field effect. Now, what that lets you do is focus on the main subject and blur the background. It can isolate the subject, draw your attention to it. It's a really nice effect to try, but you just have to be very, very careful with your focusing. So frame it up. In this instance, I've also managed to get a tourist landmark in the background, St. Paul's Cathedral. Make sure you tap on the main subject to focus on it. And if you hear that double beep and get that green square, you know you're in business. Take the shot and you're done. I'm also leaning on the wall here. Not only is it giving me better stability to avoid camera shake, but it's also allowing me to make very, very fine tunings on the actual composition. Again, that's very important when you're focusing very close to a subject, because that depth of field, or the amount that's in focus, can be very, very, very small. So you have to get it just right. Normally, when you're on a bridge like this, you're standing as far away as possible to try and fit it all in, right? But if you look closely, you may be surprised what you can find. And in this case, some anonymous artist has put tiny pictures all the way along it. Now, compositionally, you may think the best approach for a rectangular picture is to get straight above it and get it nice and square on. And that's okay. But I think it's more interesting to turn the angle of the camera by 45 degrees. And I'm going to tilt it down, use the actual bridge as a rest for the camera, and I'm using these lines here as diagonal lines across the picture. They cut across it and make it much more dynamic. As always, when you're this close to the subject, make sure you tap it just before you take your picture to make sure it's all in focus. I love going to different locations, unusual locations, to get detailed shots. We're actually at the moment on the banks of the River Thames. This is normally flooded at different times of day, so when the water goes out, what's left behind is a great deal of rust and a lot of algae and moss and all sorts of other colours. And I think it makes a fantastically detailed shot. You've got the metal structure, the rust and the moss and the algae all around it. It looks really, really nice. Now, compositionally, all I'm trying to do here is, again, get these lines on either side nice and square. I don't want those lines to converge, so I've got to be careful that I'm not pointing up or pointing down too much. Again, I can use the on-screen grid, the guidelines that I like so much on every camera, to make sure I've got that lined up exactly right. And always remember to take more than one picture at every location. I quite like the way that looks now, but maybe it looked even better closer still. And remember, the closer you get to the subject and the further the distance of the background is away from it, the more you can achieve those shallow depth of field effects with the blurring as it goes further and further away. I've always been fond of mosaics, and I've always loved Space Invaders. So when Space Invader mosaics invaded the city, I knew I had to take some pictures of them. This happened a long time ago, so unfortunately it's a little worse for wear. Some of these tiles are missing now, which is a little bit sad. Now, when it was in its full entirety and looked beautiful, then I would go for a face-on picture of it. I really want to see that full mosaic. But now I'm going to go just for a kind of more of an abstract detail. I position the camera at a very low angle and I'm looking up the wall, so these lines are all going to converge to a point. That really, again, draws your attention to the mosaic itself and, again, gives the picture more dynamics. It's more exciting to look at. Don't be afraid to embrace a bit of urban decay either as you walk around town. This concrete post has been bashed in some way in its past. to expose the rocks below, the reinforced steel interior, and what you're left with is a beautiful set of textures and colours. I really like the way that looks. And you can turn it into a really abstract picture depending on how you frame it. Now, more and more cameras these days are coming with 2 lenses, and you can also use that for close-up work. It's not just for portraits or landscapes. So I'm using a zoomed-in portrait lens at the moment, but if I switch to the wider landscape view, you can see those curved, geometric distortion around the edges where it's become all curved. I'm going to embrace that effect, get closer to my subject. The camera should still focus on it, and I'm going to position it to one side so it's staring into the frame. And this is also the kind of subject that works really well if you want to turn up the colour, increase the saturation, or get rid of it altogether for a black and white option. Particularly if you turn up the contrast, that can be a very effective technique. And don't forget, if you order a nice cup of coffee, make sure you take a close-up picture of the bubbles on the foam, another really nice textured surface. So here I want to get really close. Instead of photographing the whole cup of coffee, I want to really focus in on these bubbles in the foam, which appear a few seconds after it's been served. I really like the detail in them, they look really nice. So what I've hopefully illustrated in this video is that there's textures, details, patterns and colours everywhere you look. Not just the big obvious shapes like famous tourist attractions, buildings, landscape views, but those really little things that can really characterise the town. In fact, when I go on holiday or on trips, it's often those little details that really remind me of a visit to somewhere that really has meant something more to me. And if you're trying to put together a more interesting portfolio or Instagram feed, these detailed shots can work really, really well in between the main, more normal pictures.